Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Black History Month keynote. Tonight, we celebrate and highlight the importance of student activism, particularly within the Black community and within Black Student Union. This year at the U of I, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary and 50 years of activism of the Black Student Union on our campus. Yay! Many of the positive changes in creating a welcoming and inclusive environment at the U of I are thanks to the long and difficult work that our student leaders engage in on a daily basis. I'm looking forward to tonight's, to listening to the inspirational work of our keynote speaker, Zyahna Bryant. The Black Student Union President, Alphonse Crittenden, a second-year computer science major, will introduce her shortly. At this time, I want to remind our audience to enter questions in the Q&A box at any time, and we will try to get through as many questions as possible during the Q&A session, which will be moderated by the Black Student Union Vice President, Princess Kana, who is a junior transfer student pursuing her bachelor's in fine arts in performance. Thank you, Princess. Lastly, I'd like to thank the sponsors of the program, the Black Student Union, Equity and Diversity Unit, College of Letters, Arts and Social Science, the Africana Studies program, Diversity and Inclusion Certificate Program, the Department of Student Involvement, the Women's Center, the Office of Multicultural Affairs. We would also like to give special thanks to many of the students, faculty, staff, and community members that continue to engage in these conversations and are taking the necessary steps to create the much needed change. Now, I would like to turn it over to Alphonse to introduce Zy. Alphonse?
Thank you, Dr. Bisbee. Hello all. This spring 2021 semester has been going great so far and we would like to keep it up. This semester is the 50th anniversary of the Black Student Union on campus, and we continue to strive for greatness for years to come. Black Student Union has been working closely with many of our Black faculty, staff, and several departments on campus to schedule events for Black History Month. So far, we had a lunchtime lecture series provided by KT Turner on our modern Harlem Renaissance. We had a display that has been up since February 13th in the library first floor, highlighting noteworthy African-American literature and the future of Black history. I would also like to invite you for our program next week on February 22nd at 11:30 p.m. from another great lunchtime lecture series provided by Professor Shakira Sanders, the first African-American to reach full professor at the University of Idaho College of Law. She will be presenting on Idaho's anti-affirmative action law and the impact on diversity, equity, and inclusion in our state. There will also be a few documentaries you could access for the next several weeks. So for additional information, please visit the Office of Multicultural Affairs website. Lastly, please stay tuned for our information on the Say Their Names event happening later this month. I'd like to give thanks to the Office of Multicultural Affairs and ASUI for assistance and promotion for making sure these events happen. I'm thankful and excited to introduce tonight's keynote speaker. Zyahna Bryant is an award-winning student activist, organizer, content creator, and author who published her first book, a collection of poetry and essays titled Reclaim. Zy has been featured in the New York Times, National Geographic, the New Yorker magazine, Forbes, and featured on Vice News, PBS, CNN, and BET. In 2018, she was awarded the Princeton Prize in Race Relations and the Bassett Award for Community Engagement from Yale University. She founded the Charlottesville High School Black Student Union at the age of 14. In the spring of 2016, Zy wrote a petition calling for the removal of Robert E. Lee's statue and renaming of Lee Park in downtown Charlottesville, and City Council voted to remove it in 2017. In 2019, Zy was appointed the youngest member of the Virginia's African American Advisory Board, where she works to advise Governor Northam on issues that impact African Americans across the Commonwealth. She also serves as a founding member of the Shawn Mendes Foundation Youth Advisory Board. She was named as a 2020 Root Young Futurist, a member of the 2020 BET 100, and Teen Vogue's 21 Under 21's class of 2019. Thank you, Zy, for your continued commitment and advocate for educational equity. You're a great inspiration and role model for many of us young activists. Please help me welcome Zy Bryant.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I am so excited to join you all today. My name is Zy, and I am a student at the University of Virginia, where I am in my second year, and I'm currently undeclared, but hoping to study African American Studies and political theory. I feel like today is an interesting day to be having this event. It's Toni Morrison and Audre Lorde's birthday. And so as a writer, those are two Black women who have been extremely just influential in my life and in the work that I've done. Before I get started on talking about why it's important to listen to young organizers, particularly young Black organizers, and why it's important to listen to Black women, I want to give a brief background of who I am. I was born in Charlottesville. My family is from there, and I am the great niece of two men who were two of the first 12 students to integrate schools in Charlottesville. I come from a family that is very active in the community and does a lot of civic engagement and community organizing work. In fact, my grandmother is the neighborhood association president for the 10th and Page neighborhood, which is one of the few Black neighborhoods that are left in Charlottesville. I grew up attending an all-white private school, and that was very, it was a motivator in the work that I did. It was very tough being there and being who I am, and just having the thoughts that I had as a Black student, where I was one of two in the entire school. And I feel like that is what made me so passionate about educational equity, because I realized that students like myself who were attending schools like that on scholarships, or who were one of two or one of three, were really suffering from a crippling public education system and the practices of private education that pushes those students to the margins. I ended up transferring to public school and realizing that it was important that I was able to use my voice and my positioning as a young Black girl to really address some of these issues. I always was in the honors and AP courses. And so seeing myself in some of those spaces while my friends were in low level courses, beneath grade level courses, it really made me even more passionate about educational equity. And so my advocacy efforts then went on to the state. I started to work with local legislators like our delegate, David Toscano, and I started to work with Andy Block, who was the head of juvenile corrections in the state of Virginia. And so that work of lobbying every year and going to the state capitol and being a part of advocacy groups in the Charlottesville community was something that became really routine for me. It's something that I really feel helped me to prepare for the work that I would do later in high school and in college. Now I participate in campaigns around living wage, around recontextualizing the physical landscapes at the University of Virginia, and understanding and further contextualizing the statues that exist in our community and on our university's campus. My mom and my grandma are huge influences in my life because they teach me the importance of standing strong as a Black woman, but also never just taking the crumbs that are offered. So in the context of this moment, the pandemic, COVID-19, the uprising from the summer, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, I think my question to you all, while you listen, I would love for you to reflect on what is a community that you want, and two, what kind of ancestor do you hope to be? What kind of legacy do you wish to leave behind? I organized my first protest when I was 12 years old. It was a rally for justice for Trayvon Martin. I organized it the day after the verdict came out. I actually watched the entire trial with my grandmother, and I was convinced that we would see justice for Trayvon. I was convinced that the galvanizing, the organizing around the issue of police brutality that had been happening in the streets all across the country would be enough to convict. And I was deeply saddened and almost shocked when it wasn't. And I realized that as a young person, I needed to say something, and I didn't know who would support me. I didn't know who my adult allies were at the time. I just knew that I had a passion to speak to people, to connect with people. And I knew that I was 12 and that I had poster boards and markers and a bullhorn. So I organized that protest within about 6 hours, and over 100 people ended up coming out that day. And I think organizing that protest really made me, it made me thirsty to want to continue to do the work, right? It made me thirsty for justice, and it made me empowered to know that people would listen to young people like myself. After organizing the Rally for Justice for Trayvon Martin, I went on to be a part of the Charlottesville Youth Council. This group was working to make sure that we had conversations about equity and about student choices and student decisions within our public school division. We were appointed by City Council, and I was on that board from the time I was in 7th grade all the way through my senior year of high school. On that board, what I found, though, was that there were so many students who were blinded by so much privilege, being one of the only students on the board who came from a single parent background, or being one of the only students on the board who came from a single Black mom who was a part of the working class, was shocking to me because I didn't realize that people weren't sharing many of the experiences that I had. So I continued my work on the Charlottesville Youth Council. And as I transitioned into high school, during my freshman year of high school, I founded the Charlottesville High School Black Student Union. I founded that space because, again, I was one of the only students in the honors and AP courses and one of the only Black students. And so it was hard for me to find community with some of my peers. It was hard to create study groups and have extracurricular cliques, or whatever you want to call them, of people who I felt had similar experiences. So I created the Black Student Union as a social space at first. I will say that it was challenging to get people to want to come out constantly. Week after week, we tried to have meetings, we tried to have food, games, raffles, and people just didn't want to come. And so it was a time for me to understand that building and organizing isn't always as easy and as simple as organizing a rally for justice for Trayvon Martin. It's not always as easy to keep people engaged on an issue that, like educational equity or like other political issues, for long periods of time. And so that's when I understood the difference between organizing and mobilizing. And Angela Davis talks about this a lot. There's a difference between getting a bullhorn and getting folks to show up in the streets and having a maintained movement that you're building over a span of time, where the goals are much larger than just having people show up in space, but where they include political advancement, civic engagement, and even public education measures. So it was a challenge to get people to come out. It was a challenge to have people engage. It was a challenge to have them open up and want to talk about the issues that needed to be talked about in our school community. But ultimately, we kept having meetings. We took a little break, and then eventually people started coming back. So, sorry, I see the chat. I'm going to close that. And I'll get to equality versus equity later. But as we had people come out and we started to get the membership up, we started to organize protests within our school community. We started to have forums, and we started a Black History Month webinar type of thing where we would have speakers come in online and speak to our student population or come into the library and give talks. And I think that that was really something that we needed. I think it was important for Black students to feel empowered to discuss their narratives and discuss their experiences with experts, with people who were making decisions in our community, and to just also have agency over their own stories. And I think that that was something that I really hold with me today in the work that I do. The Black Student Union, again, was just a social space. And then the Parkland shooting happened, and we ended up co-hosting, along with other student leaders, the walkout that we had at our school. And I think that that was a moment where it was important to me to distinguish between some of the liberal slogans that were out there that weren't really talking about race and real progressive agendas. How do we make intersectionality a reality? How do we create a framework of addressing every single issue with a critical race lens? So the walkout was a pivotal moment for the Black Student Union. We ended up then hosting our own walkout later during my senior year to call out the different inequities that we have been seeing across the district, whether it be the interactions that school resource officers were having with students, or whether it be the fact that students of color are being discouraged from taking higher level courses and exploring post-secondary educational opportunities. The Black Student Union, I talk about it so much because it really speaks to the multifaceted work that it takes to be a Black organizer in the South, and especially a young Black organizer. There's the flyering, the meetings, the talking with administration, but then there's also the fact that you have to sell to your peers this idea that it is important, that it is an urgent issue. And I think as a youth organizer, that's the hardest part. I think it is to keep people understanding that their voice does matter, that they do have impact, and that as a young person, we are in a unique position to pitch issues to people who have been hearing these issues for a very long time in a different way, to offer a new perspective. After establishing the Black Student Union, later that same year in the spring, I authored the petition to call for the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville and the renaming of Lee Park. I have to admit that when I started that petition, I didn't know really what I was getting myself into. I did not know that I would be speaking 3 days later at a press conference in the middle of Lee Park, where white supremacists would come with Confederate flags and would have my name and other city councilors' names on signs. I didn't know that I would go through a period of receiving death threats and hate mail, even to this day. And I didn't know that the statue would still be there. But what I realized is that process really changed me as a person. I look back on that time now as a 9th grader who was a part of the softball team, who was, super engaged with friends and other school-like activities, who then became in the forefront around getting Confederate monuments down in the state of Virginia. And I really am thankful for the community and collective care that I received during that time and during that whole process of petitioning to get the statue down. But I have to say that it's important that we understand the context of why it matters and how the August the 12th rallies happen. People often mistake Charlottesville for being in North Carolina, but Charlottesville is in Virginia, and there's a 20% Black population there. I think that it's important that people understand the historical context of this statue and why I wanted to get it taken down. The Robert E. Lee statue was donated to the city as a gift from Paul Goodloe McIntyre, and he was a very wealthy man who made donations throughout the city of various gifts to make sure that white people had spaces just for them. He also donated a park for Black people to stay within their own space. And so I think when understanding the events that unfolded during August 2017, it's to understand that racism is still so apparent in the landscape of the city of Charlottesville. And so like Charlottesville, there are cities all over the country where there are Confederate monuments that line the streets and that create division within the physical landscape. There are these monuments that remind Black people that, yes, the Civil War has been fought. Yes, the South did lose, but racism is not dead. White supremacy is very much so well and alive, and it continues to manifest in many different ways. So with the process of trying to get the statue down, we realized that there were so many other ways in which these statues were contributing to hidden systems. We had to think about the positioning of the statue and the fact that just a few blocks down, there are courts where Black people are being sentenced 2 and 3 times more stricter and heavier than their white counterparts. We have to understand that a few steps away is City Council, or City Hall, where City Council meets and has conversations about the fate of our public works, of how people eat, sleep, and attend school and go to work in our city. And so I think if we don't understand that these statues represent something way more than just a war or just nostalgia of the South, then we are doing ourselves a disservice. And I think that that's why it's so important that we listen to young people and prioritize their opinions and their thoughts around where we should be as a community and as a society. I was really young when I started that process. As I said, I was only 15 years old when I petitioned to get the Robert E. Lee statue down. But something I learned is that I was never too young to get started. Since then, I have been speaking to community leaders from all across the country, students, universities, and companies and brands. And one thing that I've noticed is that they are ready for young people to be in those rooms and to have those conversations, despite the fact that the statue still remains, despite the fact that we are still dealing with the racial trauma of the August 11th and 12th attacks in Charlottesville. I have seen a shift of people being more willing to listen to young people. And I think we have to go another step further, though. I think it's important that, yes, we listen to young people, but also that we value them. I think about Fred Hampton because there's been a lot of buzz on the internet about who Fred Hampton was and the work that he did. But I'm constantly reminded of the fact that Fred Hampton was 21 years old and doing some of the most important work of his time. I think about the fact that there are leaders like Nepal, like Chelsea in New York, like Naomi, who's doing, just the work that she's doing on the national level. There's so many young people who are doing the work, who are on the forefront of what social justice means in this current moment. And I think it's important that we understand that we all have some of that fire within us. We all have the ability to make change, whether it be on a small scale at our universities or in our local communities. I think that right now, the question that I asked you to reflect on of what type of legacy do you hope to leave behind? What type of ancestor do you hope to be? And the question of what is the type of community that you want to create is very important to reflect on. I'll just give you my answers. The type of ancestor that I hope to become, or the legacy that I hope to leave behind, is one that creates room for other Black women to be in these spaces. As the youngest person on the governor's Virginia African American Advisory Board, I have been sitting at the table with other Black leaders, people who I really admire in the work that they're doing. But what I understand is that they look to me to give a youth perspective. And I know that the legacy that I hope to leave behind is one that it's known that I rose to the occasion, that I was well prepared for the conversations that I was having, that I did my research, and that I understood the gravity of the moments that I was doing the work in. I hope that my legacy includes the work of building mutual aid infrastructure. During this past summer, I worked with my sisters and a few of my friends to create the Charlottesville Black Youth Action Committee. We redistributed over $20,000 through giving out supplies and direct grants to families who needed them. And so when I think about the work that we've done in such a short amount of time, actually the picture is right behind me, I think about how young people have rose to the occasion. And so I hope that my legacy includes the fact that I never just shrunk or said I wasn't ready, but that myself and the other young people that I have the privilege of organizing with have always risen to the occasion to do the work. I hope that the type of ancestor that I am is one that encourages young Black girls to be unapologetically Black in spaces like predominantly white institutions, PWIs, or primarily white institutions, like the one that I attend, UVA, where when I'm fighting for equity or I'm fighting for justice, I see white students often gaslight me and poke at me and tell me that I'm being too aggressive or that I want fantasy as something that we are working for. But I know that we are on the brink of something that's so much bigger. And so when I'm sitting in those rooms, I constantly think about all of the young people who are to come after me. I think about all of the young people who came before me. I think about my uncles, my grandmother, my mom, and I think about the people who have been doing the work to make sure that I'm in the position that I'm in. And so I think that when we really think about what we want to do or how we want to accomplish it, I think it's important that we keep those people in mind. The community that I hope to create is one that genuinely listens to and understands and values the experiences of Black women, Black trans people, Black queer people more generally, and Black youth. It is a world and a community that understands that the work is not just something that comes with a tax write-off. It's not just something that is done through nonprofit organizations. but the work is something that is ongoing, and it's informal. It's giving and redistributing funds. It is tearing down systems that have been deeply rooted and have been longstanding, but that continue to oppress us. And so I think the community that I hope to cultivate is one that welcomes all people, one that doesn't shy away from the conversations that need to be had, and one that really values people of all different walks of life, one that values people who are differently abled, one that values people of the working class, and one that understands that these conversations have long been exclusive. They have excluded so many voices. And so I think it's important that we really think about the fact that we have to invite more people to the table. The work is incomplete if we're not having people who have the most lived experiences in the room. The work is incomplete if we're talking about defunding the police and we're not having people who live in communities where gunshots are often fired off included in the conversation. We're not doing the good work to talk about living wage or what the minimum wage should be if we don't have low wage workers included in the conversation. And so I think my work at UVA has really been defined by opening access, opening these rooms to people who haven't been included in these conversations. To talk about youth, I can say that one of my biggest challenges in doing this work has been my age. I constantly walk into spaces feeling very afraid that people will not value what I have to say because of the fact that I'm a young person. I spent this summer organizing with my good friend Marquise, who's down in Portsmouth, organizing with my friend Jamie Turner, who's in Northern Virginia, organizing with my best friends Althea and Trinity, who are also in the Charlottesville community, and my younger sisters who just turned 15 and who are new organizers here in the Charlottesville community as well. We spent time having the conversations about how do we not sell out? How do we continue to do this work in a way that's ethical, in a way that makes sense for what we're trying to do, but also keeps our ears to the ground so that we can remember who we're doing it for. We're living in a time where social justice work is highly profitable, it's marketable, and people are realizing that they can make a bag off of talking about white supremacy. So where does that leave the young Black people who have lived through these issues? Where does it leave the single mothers who may not have the language to be at these fancy symposiums and be a part of, academic discourse, but who have the valuable experiences that we need at the table? And so we spent a lot of time trying to look to earlier writers like Toni Morrison, look to scholars like Saidiya Hartman and Kimberly Crenshaw, and to look to past organizers like Fannie Lou Hamer to give us the context that we needed to continue the work that we wanted to do in a way that made sense for our own communities across Virginia. I think it's important to understand now that we can't wait any longer. Young people can't wait any longer to work up the courage to get on the front lines. Because the truth is, we need people in all positions. But I think it's important to also note the fact that now is a time where we have to make the decision of whether we want to create an equitable society, whether we want to be on the side of justice, or whether we want to just be the person who was passive and who just let things go and went with the flow. I think the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor woke up our country and reminded people that we are still in a time where Black lives do not matter to many people. Black lives do not matter to many institutions. And so it's important that we understand that we're still fighting. We're still in the civil rights movement. It never ended. And so I think it's important that we understand that young people have the power to make change, but they have to be invited to the table. I don't think any conversation about social justice or about the political climate is complete without a young voice at the table, because we are the generation that's been critical. But I won't say that there aren't generations before us that haven't been equally critical. In fact, if you look at every progressive movement over the past 80 years, we can point back to people who have been young and who have been on the front lines of certain issues, whether it's the suffrage movement, whether it's the race riots that happen across the country, whether it's the civil rights movement, or whether it's now talking about school shootings. We know that young people are the voices that need to be included, and they offer a perspective that encourages the community that they're addressing to look forward to new innovative ways to address the issues that have been around for a very long time. I want to encourage you all to get active in your community, whether it's creating flyers, whether it's just showing up to meetings, or whether it's putting together lectures around topics that you think need to be discussed. I think that we often really just think about people in the streets with protest signs and bullhorns as the only form of the work, but the work is so much deeper than that. And for so long, we haven't done the other forms of the work that needed to be done, and that is why the movement has been so fragmented, in my opinion. I talked with my sisters last night and I asked them, how's your mental health? And they didn't have really direct answers for me. And so before we got on, I was asked, what is one of my main challenges as an organizer or an activist? And I will say it's one, finding space for self-preservation and self-care. I think we keep doing the work and we keep showing up. This past summer, I put in over 200 hours of community service within 1 month alone. And I think that that just goes to show that we have so much work to do and we have to keep going, we have to show up, but it's so important that we also take care of ourselves. So many Black activists end up dying from different mental health concerns, or not being able to address their wellness overall. And so I think it's important that this new wave of activists and organizers really have those conversations that are uncomfortable about Black mental health, about how we are preserving ourselves and how we can't pour from an empty cup. So if we're not pouring into ourselves, we can't then pour into the community. Another challenge that I've had is being able to measure progress. I think that it's important that we stop and say, okay, we've done a lot. For the longest time, people would ask me, what's your biggest accomplishment? And even though I've been on boards and commissions, I've worked with my university's president, I've worked with nonprofits, I've worked with Shawn Mendes, I still wasn't able to fully identify one thing that I was most proud of. And that's problematic. I think Black activists are often told to keep working and keep grinding, but they're not congratulated for the work that they're doing. And so when you're in a movement, when you're in the midst of it, when you are getting calls in the middle of the night because someone needs help with something, when you're waking up and realizing that you have 5 meetings a day, it's hard to really take a step back and say, wow, look at the progress we've made since 2017. Look at the progress we've made since Ferguson. Look at the progress we've made since Trayvon Martin. And so I think it's important that we're able to measure that progress and to look at where we've come, because there are people who are before us who have done so much work to bring us to where we are now. And so they didn't receive their flowers. We have to be able to give ourselves our flowers. We have to be able to honor and celebrate the progress of ourselves and of those that we co-organize with. Another question that I'm often asked is, so what's next? I'm excited for the question and answer period, but one thing I want to leave you with is we are only as good as the work that we press on to do. We're only as good as what we hope to create and what we work towards creating. And so for me, I know that this work is going to continue whether I'm a part of it or not, but I also know that the issues will continue. I know that there are students who will be pushed into the school to prison pipeline, who will not have fair chances at college or other post-secondary opportunities if we don't continue the work, right? I know that there will continue to be white supremacists who take to the streets like they did in Charlottesville, like they did in Portland, and like they continue to do in the Capitol, like in DC or in other cities across the country. And so I know that if we're not present to stand up against some of those narratives of hate, they will multiply. More people will join these radical groups and more people will be at risk, more lives will be lost. So I encourage you to just get active in some way. Find a group, find a club, find just one other person who thinks of these issues in the same way that you do, and get active, because without us getting active, without us showing up, we are allowing more people to be put into harm's way. And so as a young person, it's important that my voice is listened to. It's important that I am invited to the table, but also that we bring our friends along. We can't just tokenize some Black students. We can't just tokenize some Latinx students, but we have to make sure that everyone is, brought to the table and listened to. And I think that as we continue to center the voices of the most marginalized people, our entire community will do well. We know statistically that when Black women are centered and their needs are cared for, the entire community does well, because Black women put in so much work to our political systems to make sure that we are achieving the progress that we hope for. We know that Black women are one of the strongest voting blocs for the Democrat Party. And so when we think about who is putting in the most work to receive such little in return, we know that young Black people, Black women, and Black queer people are those people. So my challenge to you before we head into question and answer is to think about the ways in which you can get active, one, but also how you can give back to the people who are doing the work in your community. Find a Black organizer, amplify their content online. Find a Black organizer and send them a donation, and tell them that you have resources that you'd like to contribute to their work. I think that those little things are also important because, again, not everyone can be on the front lines, but everyone is responsible for doing the work of disrupting harmful narratives, dismantling white supremacy more widely in the small spaces that they have in front of them, and making sure that they are contributing to the community that they hope to be a part of and creating the legacy that they hope to leave behind. I would now like to transition into question and answer with Princess. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for that speech. It was truly, truly inspiring. Like Zai said, we're going to switch over to our Q&A. So if you guys have any questions, please put them in the chat box. Zai, while we're waiting, I have a few questions, but I'll let people type away. But one question I have is, could you describe the difference between equity and equality for us?
Yes, so equality looks like giving everyone the same thing, redistributing the same amount of resources to everyone. But equity is giving people who are at the lowest level what they need to be at the level of the person who's at the highest level. So creating a level playing field. And there's a great graphic out. I wish I could post it on the screen, but there's I think they're kids looking at a baseball field or something like that, and they're sitting on different levels of boxes. So equity looks like putting the resources into the communities that have been traditionally left out. And on a local or political level, that would look like empowering communities through grants or through equitable policies that allows people to be included in spaces that they haven't before.
Thank you. Another question that I have is, what strategies do you recommend for students who are taking classes, engaging in community organizing and activism, and also trying to make time to take care of themselves?
I think that's a tough one, but I will say it never gets perfect. Self-care is something that's ever evolving. But I would say, prioritize, rank your priorities. If there's an issue that you care a lot about, making sure that you set aside a certain amount of time every week to do that, but also to never let your studies fall behind. Because I think that, as I can speak as a Black organizer, the expectation from certain institutions is that we will fall behind because we're trying to do the work. And so it's constantly this goal to prove people wrong, to prove to them that we can do the work and also be fully engaged as students and scholars. So again, being a student comes first, and that's why we call ourselves student activists and organizers, but understanding that you can also move that work into the classroom when you're disrupting certain narratives or when you're leading conversations in class. That is activism, just a different form.
Thank you. Another question that we have from the chat is, have you received criticism or doubt from your peers? And if so, how have you dealt with them?
Yeah, I think I just ran for student council this past year. And so this is my first time serving in the student council at UVA. I think it's important to note that they've only had one Black woman president, and that was in 2004. So just thinking about the fact that there are so many student leadership clubs, but when Black students enter into them and have the agenda of bringing students along who haven't been represented for a long time, you face so much backlash from students and peers who are perfectly fine with maintaining the status quo. And so for me, a challenge has been standing my ground. And as a Black woman, I think in student council, there are back channel conversations about, oh, we're gonna put together this legislation this week, or we're gonna talk about this during the meeting. And then when it's time to get to the meeting, I'm the only person talking for Black students. I'm the only person talking for first-gen students. And when the backlash comes of, oh, well, do you have proof of this? Or how do we talk about free speech for everyone? Or when, you know, the combative remarks come, my white counterparts are silent, right? And so I think that that's the biggest challenge. That's where the backlash gets to me, because it's not about backlash, that's natural. Black activists have faced that since the beginning of time, and the repercussions of progress have been race riots, have been lynchings, and other forms of white violence to disrupt the work of Black progressive people. That does not bother me. What bothers me is that people claim to be allies, and then when it's time to speak up or say something or disrupt a narrative, they're silent. And so I think that that's where I've really been trying to do a lot of work to train other young students who are my age, who are white and who have privilege, to know when it's the time to step up.
Yeah, that's so good. Another question from the chat, has there been any progress on the Robert E. Lee statue and for its removal?
Yes, so the statue still remains, but there have been a ton of lawsuits that have come in Charlottesville from, you know, people who are hoping to defend these statues, not just in Charlottesville, but all over Virginia and all over the South. So with the ongoing litigation, it's very hard for the city council to just pick it up and move it to somewhere else. So there was a trash bag on it for a while, a tarp, to cover it, which was a decision that city council made, I think in like 2018, 2019. That tarp has since been removed as it was considered illegal by a local judge. So right now the statue still remains, but there has been a change in state legislation granting localities the power to decide the fate of their Confederate monuments and statues. So right now, the big ticket question is the statue a war memorial? And if so, legally, there are different stipulations that come along with removing it or understanding whether or not it can be removed at all. So Charlottesville's kind of in a standstill with that. I don't think the pandemic is helping that process at all. So we are hoping to, in the coming months, refocus the community around engagement measures to make sure that the statues are still a conversation that is willing to be had.
Yeah, that's so good. Here's another question. Throughout your experience, which social media platform did you find the most effective to reach your peers?
I think to reach people who are my age, I think Instagram is the best. I tried using Twitter, but what I find is that I always get like professors following me to partake in some of these conversations, or like, you know, academics. And so I think to find a more wide range of people of different ages, and specifically people who are my age and people who aren't as tapped into like political conversations and discourse, I think Instagram has been the most helpful. This past summer, I had the opportunity to collaborate with Shawn Mendes and his team to do an Instagram takeover. And I know with the pandemic and us not being able to have like as many in-person events, a lot of celebrities and brands and organizations did Instagram takeovers as a way to highlight and amplify Black voices. So I think that that's really effective.
Yeah. Another question is, if minority students find themselves in a situation where they are being tokenized, what can they do to overturn that?
I think that's a really good question. I didn't realize how bad tokenization was until I got to UVA. So I think it's important to be unwavering in those positions. Like, it's so easy, because institutions make it this way and because white supremacy operates in this way, to get into these positions, add them to your resume and say, wow, like, this is so great. I'm on this board, I'm on this commission, I'm, you know, in these people's ears, and these important people value me. But if you look around and you don't see them hoping to invite other people like you to the table, then you understand that that's a problem, but also that you're in a unique position, because now that's where you can do collective bargaining. That's where you can say, hey, you don't get my voice if you don't bring these other people in as well. And I think that that was a challenge that I faced at UVA when George Floyd was killed. Our university president released a statement that was very lackluster, saying that he understood how Black people felt during this time, and really not offering any concrete solutions as to how we could address the issues that existed within our own university community. I said, I will not come back to your council, to your executive council, until you address these certain issues. It was highlighted in Forbes, it was a story, and then we saw a new task force appointed. And so I think, yes, there is the whole white supremacist complex of continuing to create task force and council and group and working group and organization to address these issues that really you just need to bring Black people to the table and say, okay, what do we need to do? But I think that that was a lesson for me to understand that we can't be bought by leadership positions and seats at tables. We have to understand that in every space that we're in, we have to come with an agenda. We have to come with things that we are requesting and that we are demanding. And we have to use that position and that power as a way to leverage for those goals. And if you're not doing that, then you are participating in the tokenization and the status quo.
Mm-hmm. That was so good. Here's another one from the chat. Coming from a small town, I get frustrated easy with how little progress my community is making. In the end, I feel like giving up because it feels as if my area is going the opposite way of progression. How do I turn this frustration into motivation?
Mm-hmm. I'm actually gonna pull that up because I wanna make sure that I'm addressing the question right. I think it's tough. I think being in Charlottesville, I've been frustrated, especially this summer when seeing how some of my organizing friends in different bigger cities are able to pull out more people for marches and rallies and are able to have better conversations about the issues that exist within their community. But I think we have to start somewhere. I can say confidently that in 2010, nobody was talking about white supremacy in Charlottesville, right? If you said white supremacy out in Charlottesville and in other small towns like it across the country, if you were to say white supremacy in a space, everyone would be like, what are you talking about? Excuse you, we're not going to do that. We're not going to talk about race. And now we're seeing people warming up to having conversations about white supremacy. And they don't just want to know what is white supremacy. They want to know, how can they not be a white supremacist? Who are the white supremacists in our community? What have they done? What is the history? And so I think it's a long trajectory, like there's a long path to get to where, you know, it's a comfortable conversation and where race is a factor in every conversation that you're having about political issues. But I mean, it's a fight that's worth it. And so I say, again, find people who have similar thoughts, who want to do the work, and get them engaged in whatever issue that you want to start addressing. And I started with my close friends in high school, and now I'm able to collaborate with university professors before I even came into the university. You know, there are people who value my voice because they see that this is an issue that I care deeply about. We have to be willing to build movements and not just participate in moments. And so I think right now, again, it's Black History Month, so it's perfect to have a conversation about white supremacy or about how Black people have overcome struggles. But what about in March? What about in April? And so I think continuing the work through finding people who are just as passionate about it is a way that you can build a movement and create impact beyond just a moment.
That's great. This is one I really like. It's another question from the chat. It says, as an ally, I am timid to speak for others. How do I navigate that fear and feel confident that I will not say the wrong thing?
Mm-hmm. I think The issue is that we're not asking for allies to speak for us. We as Black people, we are fully capable of telling our own stories. The issue is that we just don't have access to some of the same platforms and resources that our white counterparts do. What we need allies to do is put their resources, their privilege on the line in order to make sure that our voices aren't falling on deaf ears, if that makes sense. To make sure that the demands that we are requesting aren't just going in one ear and out the other. And so as an ally, that's where you step in and say, okay, the BSU proposed this back 2 months ago. I'm a white student. I'm paying my tuition. What about the BSU's demands? Sending emails to the dean's office, sending emails to the president's office, you know, saying I am fully in support of what the BSU is calling for. And I think that having those types of actions from students at UVA has been highly effective because it shows the administration that not only Black students want this, the entire community wants this. And the entire community understands that when Black students' needs are addressed, that they all do well. And so I think as an ally, showing up to protests is great. But when we are in those moments where Black people are at high risk, whether it's interactions with law enforcement, whether it's uncomfortable conversations in class where a professor or a student may have made a comment that's racially insensitive and ultimately racist, that's where a white ally is supposed to step in and say, hey, this is inappropriate. We need to disrupt this narrative. And so if you're timid, it is a hard thing, but I think there's no perfect time to do it. You just have to know when it's time to step up as an ally. And so, you know, it's advocacy efforts are ongoing and there are things that develop over time, but you know, you can never do it wrong when you are just getting started. You know, you're working out of good intentions. So I'd encourage you to keep working at it and definitely follow up with me. I'm always happy to speak to white students who are hoping to get engaged.
That's good. Is there like any place that your email, do you want to let us know where we can contact you?
Yeah, so my Instagram is Zy Said So, ZYSAIDSO. And my Twitter is at Zyahna B, so at ZYAHNA B. And I'm always happy to field DMs and things like that.
Okay. Well, we have one last question, and it says, given all that you've accomplished at a young age, what are your future dreams and aspirations?
I was listening to my professor earlier, and he's been talking about joy for the past 3 weeks, but he's also been talking about this idea of dreaming and about how your dreams are so often stifled or painted by your reality. And so for me, I'm a first generation college student. I come from a Black mom. I have 2 younger sisters. And so my aspirations include giving back to the people who have given to me and continuing to be in positions to redistribute resources, redistribute funds, and bring other people onto platforms that I've had access to. But I guess professionally, my goal is to make activism or the framework of organizing into a career, whether it be fighting for civil rights or doing policy work. I know that activism is not just something like a hat that I just put on. It's not just an extracurricular club. It is a way of life. And so the way that I have spent a lot of time fighting for equity, I hope to continue that in professional spaces as well. And so, yeah, the future, I'm not really sure what it looks like. I think it changes every day when I recognize that there's a different way that I can show up for my community and for people who look like me. So advocacy and fighting for equity is something that I will always do. And I'm open to new ways to be able to do that in the future.
That is truly inspiring. I just want to thank you so much for speaking with us on behalf of BSU here and the Office of Multicultural Affairs. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm going to hand it over to Corinne and she's going to close us out. But thank you so, so much.
Thank you.
Hi all. Yes. Thank you again for being here. We definitely are sorry that there was a few questions we couldn't get to, but you know, Zai, we really appreciate your time tremendously, and just like Princess said, that really was inspiring. So thank you for Zai. Thank you, you know, for our many students with the Black Student Union who work so hard to put this on and also help facilitate and moderate and kind of engage with the questions. We still have, you know, several weeks of celebration, honoring and education for Black History Month. So one thing I will do really quick is I will put the OMA website in the chat, just so y'all can see kind of what some of those events are coming up here. As was mentioned when the event first began, definitely keep an eye out for information about we have our lunchtime lecture speaker series that's going to be happening at 11:30 a.m. Next Tuesday, February 22nd. There is also going to be some documentary recommendations on our website. And then there will also be a Black Lives Matter vigil, kind of a say their names event that will be happening later in the month as well. So thank you all again. Keep your eye out for more events as the month goes on, and have a good night.